Radio Free Liberty is coming to us with another wild battlefield report, talking to soldiers engaged in the fight against Russians in Bakhmut. And we are going to talk about the evolving Russian strategy and Ukrainians' response to them. Let's get into it.
Spot.
Okay, here's what's kind of interesting. A couple of interesting details. First, this guy's using a Mark 19, a NATO. I believe it is definitely in the U.S. arsenal. We used to have them mounted on our vehicles when we were operating in areas with a lot of standoff distance. But what's interesting is we always treated them as sort of a support by fire weapon, able to bring a lot of power to the battlefield if the battlefield was open enough that there was low risk of collateral damage to civilians. But this is how it's classically supposed to be used. You can see here, it's almost an indirect fire weapon. The user is going to know the distance of the area they need to support. And because it is a grenade launcher, the grenades have a really high arc. So if you're firing them from an open position, you can actually pretty easily do the calculations and figure out where you approximately need to aim it in order to suppress an enemy position. So it's almost like a light mortar is a good way to think of it. But these, unlike a mortar, these 40 millimeter grenades need about 50 meters of distance in order to arm. They have to do a certain number of rotations. So again, for us, when we would have our gunners carry them, those gunners always had an M4 for covering that space in that first 50 meters. And again, in an urban environment where almost all contact would be potentially happening inside 50 meters, we just wouldn't take the Mark 19. But this is the way it's classically meant to be used. Also fascinating, you can see he has a fairly fast style helmet, high cut, room for its ear protection, whereas this looks like the RTO or second man of this team is rocking an old school Kevlar. What's interesting too is he looks like he's rocking a classic UCP ACU camo pattern and a UCP plate carrier. Never seen this. Have I never seen this? I've never seen this style of plate carrier. I have seen other UCP plate carriers. When I was, again, in Afghanistan, I was in there for this like weird transitional moment where the plate carriers were fielded, but we were still using UCP. They hadn't yet switched over to a version of the camouflage that looks a lot like the kind you see soldiers wear today. And so we were actually issued plate carriers, but this isn't ridiculous. The primary threat in RAO was not small arms fire, it was IEDs. And IEDs, like an artillery shell, sometimes they literally were artillery shells, damage using shrapnel. So while yes, the level 4, level 5 ceramic plates that protect you in a plate carrier are the same ones in an IOTV, the IOTV has a ton more Kevlar protection for your upper body. And in response to an IED strike, you're talking about dropping a couple of pounds in exchange for to me, a significant reduction in the total area of protection for you as a soldier, for your upper body, for your vital organs. And so for me, I was like, I'm not switching to a plate carrier. I don't care. I don't want one. I had already kind of stripped down the IOTV of a lot of its extraneous Kevlar, the neck gaiter and the groin protector and the low back protector. So having stripped it down to just the upper body protection. I also was not a Geardo. I had a standard mag loadout. I had a radio and, pad and paper, GPS mostly, but if you know how to read a map and you know your AO really well, I mean, a GPS isn't going to be like a game changer, especially when you have vehicles. Again, if you do a bunch of dismounts, different story, right? That extra 3 pounds could make a huge difference. You're going to need a bunch more gear, but you know, we were almost always mounted, or what you'd call in this conflict mechanized. We weren't really mechanized. You get what I'm talking about. So one of the things that we've seen, first off, if you guys want some of the more intense combat footage from Bakhmut, that is all on the Patreon. That's, of course, because YouTube's monetization policies won't let me do breakdowns of the most intense combat footage. So if you want that, want access to that, a new video I drop every Friday. I look at the week's most viral combat footage, and it's a great way to support the channel that is not dependent on YouTube and their policies, which seem to change all the time. So check that out. The link is in the description. But let's take a look at the tactical situation in Bakhmut. Now, at the time this is filmed, it was probably filmed, I think, several days ago. So the situation probably looks something like this. And you could see, honestly, I suspect that the Mark 19 is probably around here in one of these large buildings. You can see it overlooks some low ground out here, a low ground series and rows of houses. So I think the Mark 19 is probably in one of these 3 buildings. We'll zoom in further still. And it's probably providing coverage from an elevated position into these series of buildings here. So chances are infantry are along this line of contact. As Russian forces try to advance, they radio the Mark 19. They say, hey, listen, I'm going to give you a grid coordinate, or I'm going to give you a specific location. I want you to try to put rounds. They probably have what's called a sector sketch, if they're smart, where they'll sit there and say, hey, do you know the house with the bright blue roof? And they'll say, yeah, I already have it, all the settings plugged in to put rounds on that blue roof. They'll go, great, I need you to put rounds 50 meters beyond it. And they go, got it. We're going to add 50 meters of elevation and send rounds. So the Mark 19 is a really effective weapon. This is, I think, the situation that they're in. You can see Russian forces working to encircle Bakhmut, and I suspect that Ukrainian forces are beginning their withdrawal, because as you can see, there's been a sort of very slow, plodding advance by Russian forces. Ukrainians only counterattacking. You can see it around here to keep these 2 main avenues out of the city open and clear for their forces.
І намагаються штурмувати місто, але вже фактично вуличні бої. І цікаво, як для мене.
Yeah, street-to-street fighting with no civilians is intense, because a lot of times the presence of civilians precludes you from using your heaviest weapon systems. But with no civilians, it's simply hard to see. You have poor visuals. You have really dangerous and difficult terrain where streets form these dangerous they're literally called linear danger areas in doctrine. Tons of linear danger areas, but then tons of cover in the form of buildings and concealment. Literally, it's almost impossible to get even 360 security. It's so hard. You have almost no standoff distance.
Звісно, відчуття розуміючі. Бахмут, снаряд, здається, падає раз в секунду. Але, знову ж таки, в центрі міста зараз перебувають українські військові, вони тримають лінію.
Right, and this is the thing, the Ukrainian forces are on the defensive in order to prepare for the coming offensive in the spring, or I actually suspect it's much sooner than that. Their Ukrainian forces are trying to be, I believe, more disciplined with their troops. So you notice there's fewer counterattacks. They're willing to yield ground. Their goal is to maximize Russian casualties while minimizing Ukrainian casualties in order to ensure that their best, most seasoned combat troops are going to be available for operations in a major counteroffensive.
Бьем и бьем их, шакалов. Лезут, как тараканы из-за печки. Тут по-другому никак.
So this is actually interesting. Russia has recently released a manual. They believe it seems to be true. reorganizing their Ministry of Defense forces actually to look more like Wagner Group mercenaries. And the idea of what they're calling their tactical assault group is that basically you have this core light infantry companies, 3 light infantry companies that are supported by a small contingent of armor, infantry fighting vehicles, mortars, drones. Again, just a smattering across a battalion. But the primary force is the infantry assault group, which is literally just light infantry that is simply told to advance. And the idea is that these companies are made up of trained soldiers who can do things like operate a mortar or operate a tank. And then you have the untrained, mobilized conscripts, or in this case, former prisoners, who make up the assault groups, who need very little training, are just given a place to go and a direction to get there, and don't need this sort of advanced training because their role is so simple, and instead it falls on the assault groups or the mortar teams or the tanks to provide support to this assault element.
Да.
But you can see the effect. The Ukrainians describe how this actually plays out in real life.
Что можем, держим.
Да.
Что не можем, тоже держим.
Да.
Держим
Осколки
все.
привезли, давайте их потом.
Right. They are holding on to what they can and trading space for time, right? They'll yield space. They're just here to facilitate the withdrawal. You can see clearly that if Bakhmut ever held any significance, it doesn't now. This town is completely obliterated.
Ситуація така, що ми тримаємось, ми лупимось, але що робити? Лупимо тим, чим є. Немає на один засіб там чогось. Лупимо з того, що є, стримуємо піхоту. Тут основна проблема – це піхота.
All right, they are not sparing anyone. That is, this has been consistent throughout this, as Russia has begun to safeguard and marshal more and more of its valuable material, like tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, mortars, artillery, artillery shells. Now that those are used sparingly, the resource that Russia has in spades is human lives. And so that is what they are expending at the greatest rate by most of these reports.
Бо, бачиш, вони не жаліють людей, тут просто засіяно, оця вся лінія зараз засіяна просто трупаками, але тут стоїть вже не оці зеки. Можливо, вони там є частина, тут стоять регулярна армія, тут стоїть ВДВ якийсь їхній. Але ВДВ отримує запікай пі***.
So here's what's really interesting about, they say, oh, they're paratroopers. And almost undoubtedly, they have more training than the Wagner group, simply because they're able to go through a standardized pipeline through the Russian Ministry of Defense. But even their paratroopers are still subject to a what sometimes is called the death spiral for a unit. And this is the idea that high attrition warfare, an example would be another fighter pilots in World War II, when there's or bomber crews, when there's a very high attrition rate, what ends up happening is that you have your varsity cadre, so to speak. These are the guys who've completed the full peacetime set of training, and are in combat. When they are attrited, become KIA or WIA, right, they're backfilled maybe by a people who've completed the full set of training, but maybe they don't have as much time in garrison to like do additional training, right, field exercises and the like. So they're a little greener, which means they take casualties at slightly higher rates. So then they're backfilled by people who have no garrison time. They just finish their training and off they go. And then they take casualties at slightly higher rates still. And then the next iteration is maybe paratroopers who've gone through a truncated training, a shortened version of their training. Their casualty rate gets higher. Now you have paratroopers who've gone through a fraction of the training of that varsity team, taking casualties at considerably higher rates. So when they talk about these being paratroopers, they may be assigned to paratrooper units. If I were a betting man, I would bet they have never done an actual airborne operation in their lives, not in training, not anything.
З якою інтенсивністю лізуть?
Why would you waste your time doing an airborne drop if since you need them in the front lines today?
Кожний день. Кожний день малими групами. Не було дня, щоб хтось кудись не просувався. Але малі групи, більше вони не можуть, так як на Солидарі, вони там 50-30 чоловік не біжать. Вони біжать по 10, стандартна схема, накопичується далі.
Yeah, formations of 10, this is actually 10 to 15 is the platoon size in an assault group. But 10 is just so small. You can see that a 10-man group, the problem with the 10-person group is that, look at this Mark 19. Let's say you get a grenade lands just right. It wounds 2 of this 10-man group. Well, now that's 8. Plus, those wounded need to be carried at the very least, really. So they should be carried by 2 people. So now you're down to 4. So you've lost 40% of your combat power from a single lucky Mark 19 grenade. And again, if you want to actually, let's say each one of those wounded need 2 people to carry them. Now the majority of your combat power is spent either being wounded or treating wounded, and your remaining 4 people can basically get security in 4 cardinal directions. So you are potentially 2 casualties away from being combat ineffective. This is why these units of 10 can oftentimes be sort of almost self-destructive. Because they simply lack the resilience of a larger unit. When I was even in Iraq and Afghanistan, where you had when I was in Afghanistan, but the U.S. Army also had this policy in Iraq, the minimum formation for a patrol was actually 16 people, right? And that was no accident. It meant you could, take up to 4 casualties and still be able to operate your vehicles, conduct a level of CASEVAC, do vehicle recovery. It was no accident, right? That math was specifically designed to ensure that you could continually operate even in the face of a level of casualties.
Але до чого я вів, що це якісь регулярні війська, і вони евакуюють своїх 200-х, вони витягують своїх 200-х, вони цим паряться.
Чи є відчуття, що змінилася тактика?
Нічого критично не змінилося. Як воювали, як перли, так і пруть. Єдине, що може, трохи продуманіше, не так дерзко, по-тупому, там, в повний ріст, без бойового.
Yeah, this is just hard to hear. I mean, standing up, this is an evidence of just no combat training at all. Like, really hard to understate. Again, it's hard for me because I was involved in the military, right? I joined the ROTC program my freshman year of college. I did basic combat training the summer of my freshman year. I went to airborne school in sophomore year. I did sort of an officer candidate selection pre-course junior year, and then of course I graduated and went to my officer basic course. We used to call Bullock. I don't know what they call it now. The point is that for me, my entire adulthood, certain basic concepts were instilled in my brain. So the idea of being cover and concealment and individual movement techniques and not standing up in a combat zone tall with nothing between you, it's so inconceivable. It's hard to explain. It's like, imagine somebody that gets stumped by 2 times 6. You can, even without knowing math, you should be able to rationalize it. But that's the military equivalent of being stumped by 2 times 6.
Ні, тут уже нормально забігають, переміщуються, закріплюються.
And it's not to dunk on them or call them dumb. It's to call them not properly trained. Just like if you never went to school, you may actually struggle with, how many are 2 groups of 6.
Що прям там тактика? Малі групи. Міські бої, тактика малих груп. Все.
right, we're almost certainly going to have to blur this out because YouTube doesn't like it. But just a couple of things. Okay, it said Russia's trying to encircle the city. This is correct. But then this one, the holding the city could keep Moscow from seizing all of Ukraine's Donetsk region. This is not accurate. This is inaccurate. If the Ukrainian forces are encircled, somehow their lines are broken. But even then, as they point out, Russian forces are not mechanized. They cannot break lines and conduct a lightning advance. Bakhmut is not the linchpin to the Donetsk region. And this is sort of what the disingenuous reporting that sort of bothers me is that they create the narrative that there are high stakes. The truth is this is high stakes because Russia has made taking Bakhmut to be an extremely important moral victory for them. But it is not high stakes strategically. This is the stakes for Ukrainian forces are that they can absolutely shred Russians and destroy their combat power. That is what Bakhmut's significant is to Ukraine, especially at this point. Look, there's no industry, there's no cities, there's no civilians here, right? The Ukrainian forces are there to attrit Russian forces. That's it. And Russian forces are there to score a propaganda victory. So anyway, guys, the link as always is in the description. Thanks so much for joining me. And of course, thank you to the patrons of Patreon. You guys are such big supporters of the channel. I appreciate it so much. Thanks to our Colonel tier patrons, Melissa Janeway, Tad Rockwell, Derek Chang, EC1978, Predator 7R, Judith Haynes, and Robin Colburn, all our lieutenant patrons. I appreciate you guys so much. You really are the ones who let me do this. And I will catch you guys in the next one.